Sally Benson. I'm a faculty member in the Energy Resources Engineering Department in the School of Earth Sciences, and I'm going to be the chair of this committee. So we're here today for Nikit Abhyankar's dissertation defense, and he's going to be talking about essays on modeling energy futures of India, natural gas, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And this is a dissertation that's submitted to the EMA Interdisciplinary Program on Energy and Resources. And with that introduction, welcome, and let's get started.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for coming by. So I'm going to talk about my thesis, of course, which is on modeling India's energy future. But before I begin, I want to show you the satellite image of India at night. So this is how India looks at night. But about a couple months ago, something unusual happened. There was a major electrical grid failure in the northern and eastern parts of India. And about 300 to 400 million people lost access to electricity on 30th of July, 2012. There was a big UN cry in Indian as well as international media. But although power outages are nothing new for Indians, the scale at which this failure happened was completely unprecedented. But the story does not end here. The same grid failure happened again on the next day, July 31st. The story does not end here either. The same grid failure was about to happen on the very next day, that is August 1st, 2012, but somehow they averted it. And here I would like to quote Steve Schneider. He used to say, "Never waste a big crisis, because it always offers you an opportunity to make better policies." And Indian policymakers seem to have realized that until they completely revamp country's energy sector, the miraculous growth story of India just cannot continue. So what are the key problems or challenges before the Indian energy sector? There are three. First is meeting the rising energy demand. As you can see in this chart, the primary energy requirement in India is expected to triple over next 20 years or so. But at the same time, the domestic production of fossil fuels has been significantly below the total fossil fuel requirement in the country. So there have been coal shortages in the country. There have been natural gas shortages, which I will talk in detail later. And there is a chronic electricity shortages in the country. And because the domestic production of fossil fuels has been below the demand, India has been importing a lot of fossil fuels, mostly from the Middle Eastern countries. So such rising fossil fuel imports has a bearing, one, on the energy security of the country, and on the other hand, increasing fuel costs in the country. The third major challenge before the Indian energy sector is climate mitigation. So although India does not have any binding commitments for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, ahead of the Copenhagen talks in 2009, India did commit to reducing its emissions intensity, that is greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP, by about 20 to 25% by 2020. So there is some action called for in this regard. So given this context, what are the key options Indian policymakers see that the country has as the future energy resources? First, natural gas. So India made series of natural gas discoveries over the last 10 to 15 years, and natural gas is expected to be a major fuel for ensuring India's energy security. Second is renewable energy. A few recent studies pointed out that India has large potential for renewable energy, particularly wind and solar. So renewable energy is one of the major future energy resources. And third is energy efficiency. And the reason energy efficiency is important is in addition to it being the cheapest cost resource, about 70% of the electrical appliances that will be used in India by 2022 are yet to be purchased. So there is a huge potential for enhancing efficiency of electrical utilization in India. All right, so my thesis focuses on these three future options for energy resources: natural gas, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of literature on the Indian energy policies. So the objective of my thesis is, one, at some places create the literature on Indian energy policies and also inform the policy debates that is happening around these sources. So these are the three parts of my thesis. In the first part, I've modeled the natural gas market in India. In the second part, I've analyzed the grid integration issues of renewable energy projects in India. In the third part, I've analyzed the impact of energy efficiency programs and utility finances and consumer tariffs, that is electricity rates in India. So let's start with the first one, natural gas markets. The motivation for this study comes from the fact that, as I mentioned, large reserves of natural gas were found off India's eastern shore about 10 to 15 years ago. And natural gas is seen as one of the key fuels that will lead India onto a clean development path and mitigate coal's dominance from India's energy basket. The second kind of motivation comes from there have been major structural reforms in the natural gas sector over the last decade or so. And the most significant of which is the private sector has started assuming greater role in all parts of the gas supply chain, exploration, production, and transmission and distribution of gas. And the current policy debate in the natural gas sector revolves around how to price the natural gas. Note that presently, the natural gas that is produced domestically in the country, the prices for natural gas that is produced domestically in the country are regulated by the government. And the government does plan to move to full price liberalization from 2014 onwards. However, despite government plans to move that, there is no literature on Indian gas markets that presents a numerical model for Indian natural gas market. And the objective of my thesis is create a numerical model for the Indian natural gas market that will help me analyze the impact of price liberalization in the Indian gas market and inform the policies. All right. The specific research questions that I'm looking at is what would be the impact of price liberalization on gas prices and quantities consumed? And secondly, what would be the impact on welfare? Would the welfare increase? Would it decrease? And I plan to answer these questions by developing a game theoretic model of the natural gas market in India. And I set up the model as a mixed complementarity problem, and I'll present the results later. But before I start describing the model, let me quickly show you the different actors in the Indian natural gas market and their physical locations. Right. All right. So this is India, not hard to guess. So this is the national capital of Delhi. This is the city of Mumbai. So natural gas demand in India is split into 4 major consuming regions. There is one in the north, there is one in the south, and there are 2 in the west, the states of Gujarat and Maharashtra. So each consuming region of natural gas has 4 types of consumers. The power sector that use gas for producing power, the fertilizer sector that use gas as a feedstock for producing urea-based fertilizers, industries, and city gas, which comprise of small-scale commercial, residential, and the transport sector. There are only a limited number of natural gas producers in the country, indicated by the blue dots. Most of the gas production is concentrated on the eastern offshore area of the country. There is one gas producer and one demand region in the east, but that's very small, and it's kind of isolated from the main market, so I haven't included that in my model. So there are a few natural gas producers off the western shore, but these fields are declining, and so the future gas production would be concentrated in the eastern offshore area of India. In addition to the domestic production of natural gas, India also imports liquefied natural gas, or LNG, mostly from the Middle Eastern countries here. And India has some reasonable infrastructure for importing LNG, and most of them are located on the western shore of the country. And there are pipelines that connect all these actors together. The solid lines indicate the gas pipelines that are already in existence and operational, and the dotted lines are the gas pipelines that are under construction and will be operational soon. All right. So before I describe the model, let me tell you what the cases I've created. So I've created 2 worlds. In the first world, I called the price regulation world. For my committee, this is same as the status quo world in the thesis. So in the price regulation world, I've modeled the way natural gas market is as of today. So that essentially models the world as it is today. I've created a second world called the price liberalization world, which assumes that the gas prices are liberalized, and see what happens if the prices are liberalized. So let's start with the first world, price regulation world, the world as it exists today. There are only a limited number of natural gas producers. mostly in the eastern offshore area. I've modeled them using the exhaustible resource theory, and there are barriers to entry into the gas production business, which means no new producers can start natural gas production, at least for the next few years, several years rather. Now, these gas producers receive a natural gas price from consumers, and this price is regulated by the government. In addition to the gas producers, there are LNG importers, and India imports LNG on the fringe. These LNG importers buy the LNG, liquefied natural gas, from the global market at international price and sell it to the Indian consumers. And there is free entry and exit into the LNG import business. Anyone can set up a new LNG terminal if they have the pipeline connection. I would note that the price that LNG importers receive from the Indian consumers is not regulated by the government. So there are markets for LNG on the fringe. So in short, in the price regulation world, there are two natural gas prices in the country. First, the regulated price by the government, and secondly, that applies for the LNG, which is set on the LNG markets on the fringe. Now, this is the demand. There are 4 demand regions. Each region has 4 types of consumers. And these actors are connected by the pipeline network. Now, government, in addition to regulating the natural gas price, intervenes into the gas market in 2 ways. Firstly, it taxes the gas producers. Now, this tax is in addition to the standard income or other kind of taxes. And Indian government doesn't like this tax to be called tax. So they call it profit share. So they get a share in the profit of the gas producers in the country. And they also give a direct subsidy to fertilizer consumers for purchasing natural gas. All right, so this is how the price regulation world looks. This is how they exist today. Now let's see what happens if prices are liberalized in the price liberalization world. In the price liberalization world, there are 3 things that change. Most of the actors, of course, remain the same. But note that the domestic gas producers no longer receive a regulated price. In fact, they compete with each other, and they also compete with the LNG importers, and the natural gas price emerges out of the market. Also note that there are only a few number of domestic gas producers, and therefore there is an oligopoly in the domestic gas supply. So I have modeled the interactions between these gas producers as a Cournot game, which means that the gas producers compete with each other by varying the quantity of gas that they supply. So this is about the gas producers. And LNG importers. Now there are no markets on the fringe for LNG. There is just one natural gas market in the price liberalization case. But also note that LNG importers buy LNG from the international market, from the global market. And the international price for LNG is significantly higher than the cost of production of the domestic gas producers. So LNG importers are at a cost disadvantage relative to the domestic gas producers, and I've modeled them as a competitive fringe. What that means is LNG importers are price takers, and the domestic gas producers are the dominant firms in the market. The third major change in the price liberalization case is there are traders that arbitrage natural gas between any 2 demand regions. And what do I mean by arbitrage? Is that if the difference in the natural gas prices in any 2 demand regions is higher than the cost of transporting gas from one region to the other, then the traders would move gas from one region to the other and earn the profit. All right. So now let's look at the key results of the model and what happens if prices are liberalized. The first set of results is prices and quantities. What is the gas price? How much gas would be consumed in the country? So on this chart, I'm going to plot the simulated gas price for a 20-year period starting 2014. So let's look at the results for the price regulation case first, and then we'll move on to the next case. So this red line is the projected natural gas price for the domestic gas, and which is regulated by the government. In the price regulation case, there are 2 natural gas prices, one for the domestic gas, which is shown here, and the other for the LNG, which is set in the fringe market. And note that this price for LNG is significantly higher than the regulated price for the domestic gas. Now let's quickly look at the gas quantities consumed in the country. So the same chart for gas quantities over a 20-year period. Now, such low domestic gas price, which is regulated by the government, has two kinds of effects. Effect number one is it creates a huge demand for natural gas. But at the same time, it does not offer enough incentives for the domestic producers to produce more gas. Now, LNG importers can always come in and fill in the difference between the demand for natural gas and the supply for natural gas. But since the LNG price is significantly higher, not many consumers are willing and able to buy the LNG from the fringe market. So the total natural gas supply is significantly below the total natural gas demand, and gas shortages develop in the price regulation case. This finding is kind of corroborated by the existing condition in the gas market in India, where one observes significant gas shortages in the country. And one of the main reasons is an artificially suppressed price for the domestic gas, which does not leave enough incentives to produce more gas. Now let's see what happens in the price liberalization case. If prices are liberalized, the gas prices increase significantly, shown by this blue line. So they increase by about 20 to 30% relative to the regulated price for the domestic gas in the price regulation case. But such increase in price again gives rise to two effects, but just in the opposite direction. On one hand, it reduces the total demand for natural gas. On the other hand, also creates enough incentives for the domestic producers to supply more natural gas. So demand reduces, supply increases up to a point where demand exactly equals the supply and shortages vanish. And as you can see, the total supply for natural gas in the price liberalization case is at least 20% higher than the price regulation case. So though price liberalization results in higher gas prices, it also results in elimination of the gas shortages in the country and increases the total supply. Now, unfortunately, the data on Indian natural gas markets is not very well maintained. And in some cases, the data is just not even collected. So I had to assume a significant number of parameter values in my model. So now I'm just going to test the sensitivity of these key results on the key parameter values. So one of the key parameters in the model is the price elasticity of demand. So I have assumed an elastic demand in my model with a price elasticity of minus 1.4, and this is based on the literature survey on several marginal fuels in different countries. Now I'm going to test what if the demand is made inelastic or if it is made more elastic, as shown by these blue error charts and the area. So if the demand is made inelastic with an elasticity of minus 0.5, naturally consumers are less sensitive to the gas prices and gas prices increase. If the demand is made more elastic, which means consumers are very sensitive to the natural gas prices, the prices reduce. Now let's look at the effect of changing demand elasticities on the total supply and demand for natural gas. So this region shows the range of total gas supply and demand over the next 20 years for different elasticities. So as you can see, if the elasticity is minus 2, which is demand is more elastic, consumers are very sensitive to gas prices, and the gas demand and supply, therefore, reduces significantly. All right. So what does it mean for the total welfare in the natural gas sector? So on this chart, I'm going to plot the total welfare created in the gas sector, split into consumer surplus on the x-axis and producer surplus on the y-axis. So this is where the total welfare essentially is the distance from the origin of this point under the price regulation case. And in the price liberalization case, as you can see, the welfare significantly increases. And you can note that there is an increase in the producer surplus as well as increase in the consumer surplus, which means that price liberalization not only improves the total welfare, but also offers an opportunity for Pareto improvement over the price regulation. And what I mean by Pareto improvement, it's someone can be made better off without making anyone else worse off. The second interesting observation from this chart is the improvement in producer surplus. It's significantly more than the improvement in consumer surplus. And this gives rise to an interesting political economic equation where the gas producers would have a strong incentive to switch to price liberalization, while consumers that receive cheap gas under the price regulation regime would have little incentive to move to price liberalization. So if you want to know more about this political economy of the price liberalization in India, I'll be more than happy to talk about it in the questions and answers session. All right. So the key conclusions from the first part. Price regulation disincentivizes domestic producers, and gas shortages in the country would continue even in future. Price liberalization, on the other hand, would result in higher prices, but would also increase the supply, and natural gas shortage would vanish. And importantly, price liberalization can increase the total welfare in the gas sector in the country. So if India wishes natural gas to be a major future source, then price liberalization would be recommended. All right. So let's move on to the second part of my thesis, which is analyzing the grid integration of renewable energy projects in India. So this part would be published as a series of 3 papers by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So the motivation for this part comes from a few recent studies have indicated that there is a large potential for renewable energy projects, for renewable energy sources in India, particularly wind and solar. At the same time, there is growing interest and policy support for renewable energy sources in India. For example, almost all states have enacted renewable portfolio standards with very attractive feed-in tariffs. And that policy seemed to have worked because there is a rapid growth in renewables capacity in India over the last decade or so. The federal government has also announced a national solar mission, which envisions building 20 gigawatts of grid-connected solar capacity over next 10 years. The federal government has also initiated a green corridor project, which means building transmission capacity specifically for transmitting electricity generated by the renewable energy sources. But despite such huge potential and good policy support, grid integration of the renewable energy is still a big problem in India. And unfortunately, the literature on grid integration issues in India is virtually non-existent. There is just one paper in the peer-reviewed journals that analyzes the grid integration issues, and that's it. So the focus of my research is on analyzing the grid integration issues. The specific research questions I have is how can the grid be dispatched for high penetration levels of renewable energy resources in India? What are the incremental costs of grid integration of renewable energy resources in India? And what is the effective load carrying capacity of renewable energy sources in India? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm not going to talk about this third part, but I'll be more than happy to take questions on that. So in this presentation, I'm only going to talk about the first 2 questions of my thesis. So I plan on answering these questions by developing an optimal grid dispatch and capacity planning model for India. All right. So let me show you the total renewable energy potential in India. This is basically from a recent NREL study in about 4 to 5 years ago. So this chart shows the total solar energy potential and solar energy resource in India. Darker the shade, better the solar resource and solar irradiance. As you can see, most of India has good quality solar resource, but barring a few areas in the Himalayas, which is right here, which are not really developable per se, the best quality solar resource in India comes in the state of Rajasthan, here in the northwest. And the total estimated solar energy potential in India is as high as 11,000 gigawatts. And just to give you a scale of numbers, the total electricity demand in US right now is about 800 gigawatts. And the projected electricity demand in India by 2030 is expected to be about 500 to 600 gigawatts, which means that the solar energy potential in India is several orders of magnitude higher than the total electricity requirement of the country. Now let's take a look at the wind resource in India. Now this chart comes from a recent Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory study, which I was a part of, on wind energy potential estimation in India. The same rule applies: darker the shade, better the wind resource. There are 2 interesting observations here. First is that most of the wind resource in India is concentrated into the southern peninsular part. And secondly, the best quality wind resource comes from the state of Tamil Nadu in the south. The total estimated wind energy potential in India is as high as 2,500 gigawatts, again several orders of magnitude higher than the electricity Sure.
clarification, when you're talking about potential in each of these cases, you're assuming what prices?
Well, this is the technical potential. This is not the market potential at whatever prices that they come.
I'll have to think about that.
Sure. Okay.
Well, let me follow up on that slightly then. That defines the spacing of solar cells.
Mm-hmm.
What's the concept of how frequently, how much you have a solar cell spaced? Is it every rooftop? Is it every, all open space? What's the concept of?
Yeah, so that's basically all open space that is available. So this is the technical potential.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is not really the market or techno-economic potential.
So that's, you keep everything shaded
By solar cells.
Solar cells
Yes.
above everybody's head.
Yes.
Nobody needs an umbrella. Okay.
That's right. So there are two other interesting observations that, well, not really observations, so facts I want to mention. First is that good quality solar resource is available in India throughout the year for almost all 12 months of the year. But the wind resource in India is kind of limited to the monsoon season in India, which is from June through September. And the second observation is that the diurnal pattern of solar irradiance, how the solar irradiance moves during the day, is very similar to that in the North American or any kind of Californian sites. But for the wind resource, the seasonal and diurnal patterns of wind energy generation is fundamentally different in India relative to how it happens in California or in North America. So let's quickly see how the Indian wind energy generation is different from that in California. So on this chart, I'm going to plot the actual wind energy generation from California for the month of July 2012 for each day of July 2012 for all 24 hours of the day. It is indexed to the annual maximum. So in California, there are like a few good days, a few really bad days. But in general, one can observe that there is a huge variability in wind generation in California on an hour-to-hour basis and also on a day-to-day basis. Now let's see how the same chart looks in India. So I'm going to plot the same chart for July 2012 for the state of Tamil Nadu in India, the actual wind energy generation from wind projects in Tamil Nadu, and see how it looks. There are two observations. One is the overall pattern of wind energy generation is literally a 180-degree opposite to that of California. And secondly, the variability in wind generations. The variation in wind generation on a day-to-day basis and also on an hour-to-hour basis is an order of magnitude smaller than that in California. However, despite such a good and more predictable kind of pattern, grid integration is still a challenge in India. And why is that a challenge? Let me show that in the next slide. So, but before I do that, let me quickly explain the different seasons in India. This is important. So if you're sleeping, it's a good time to wake up. So, though India is in the northern hemisphere, because it's subtropical, the seasons are a little different. So winter in India goes from December through February, and March through May, it's summer. It becomes really hot. And from June through September is the rainy season, also called the monsoon. And October and November is the post-monsoon. Now on this chart, I'm going to plot the actual hourly generation from wind energy projects in the state of Tamil Nadu in India for every hour of the year. And this is how it looks. The wind energy generation is quite low in the winter and summer months. It picks up by mid-May, reaches the peak during monsoon, and then comes down again by mid-October or so. So in general, wind energy generation is highly concentrated in India in the monsoon season. Now on the same chart, I'm going to plot the hourly electricity demand from the state of Tamil Nadu. Oops. And here you go. This is how it looks. So this is the electricity demand for each hour in the state. So demand peaks in the summer, and it's actually at its minimum in the monsoon where wind energy generation peaks. And that's why, despite having a more predictable pattern, it's very hard to integrate wind energy into the grid because when wind generates, the state just doesn't need it. And so the real question is there any other region or state in India that has a similar demand profile as that of the wind energy generation in Tamil Nadu? So the answer is yes, there is. So this is the state of Tamil Nadu, and this is the entire northern region of India. And this northern region, electricity demand is very similar to the way Tamil Nadu's wind generation behaves. So I'm just quickly going to show you how the similarity works by taking the example of the state of Delhi. And the reason I've chosen Delhi is electricity demand pattern is very similar to the other states in the northern part of India. And the northern states cover more than a third of the total electricity demand in India. Secondly, Delhi is mostly urban, so that's why it may represent the future appliance ownership and future electricity demand from other Indian states and other cities. And most importantly, there are no power outages in Delhi. So all the demand data that you see from Delhi can be quite reliable and also accessible. All right, so you have already seen this chart. This is the actual wind energy generation from the Tamil Nadu wind energy projects. And this is how Delhi's electricity demand looks. It has a very strong seasonal correlation with Tamil Nadu's wind energy generation. Delhi's demand also peaks in monsoon, mainly due to higher temperatures and space cooling demand. And this is also where the Tamil Nadu's wind generation peaks. And now let's also plot the solar irradiation from the state of Rajasthan on this chart and see how it looks. The solar irradiance is all over the place, but an interesting pattern is that the solar irradiance and wind generation, which is proportional to wind speeds, are highly complementary in the sense that solar irradiance peaks in the summer, while wind is the lowest, while wind peaks in the monsoon, where solar is the lowest, and solar again has a small peak in winter, where wind is the lowest. All right, so this is on the seasonal level. What happens during the day, or an average day for the 24 hours of the day, what happens? So I'm going to plot the electricity demand in Delhi for average day on each of the seasons. So this is how the average summer day in Delhi looks. So demand peaks in the afternoon. It's mostly dominated by the space cooling demand that takes place mostly in the afternoon. So it peaks in the afternoon. This is the average Delhi's day, the 24 hours, in monsoon, which is June through September. The space cooling demand in Delhi is significantly higher in monsoon. It kind of peaks in the afternoon and then flattens out. Post-monsoon, the space cooling demand drops. There is no peak in the afternoon, but there is one peak in the evening, which is for the lighting demand. And in winter, there are two distinct peaks in Delhi, one in the morning owing to the water heating demand, and one in the evening for the lighting demand. As you can see, the morning peak occurs around 9:30 in the morning, indicating people in India take pretty late showers. So now, on the same chart, I'm going to plot the wind energy generation for an average summer day. So it's pretty low, but the pattern is quite similar. It peaks in the afternoon. Let's see what happens in monsoon. The wind energy generation diurnal pattern exactly matches to that of Delhi's demand pattern. This is also the peak demand season for Delhi. Now, in post-monsoon and winter, the wind energy generation is pretty low. The diurnal pattern of solar irradiance does not change significantly by season, but it's just that it peaks in the summer and it's lowest in the monsoon. So this very good seasonal and diurnal correlation between wind and electricity demand and seasonal complementarity between solar and wind energy resources make a very strong case for integrating Tamil Nadu's wind energy generation into Delhi's electricity grid, and also using Rajasthan's solar energy generation to complement the wind generation from Tamil Nadu. So that's exactly what I did in my model. So I built a grid dispatch and capacity planning model for the state of Delhi. And what the model does, it simulates the optimal grid dispatch and generation investments in Delhi's power system from now up to 2022, that is for about 10 years. The objective of the model is pretty simple. It's just a cost minimization model. It minimizes the operational cost of the grid it minimizes the total investment cost in building new transmission lines and new generation projects, and actually the cost of transmission, that is using the existing transmission lines and so on. The resolution of the model is 1 hour, which means that the model operates Delhi's grid for each hour of the year. So there are 8760 hours in the year, and the model runs for about 10 years. So model operates Delhi's grid for about 87,000 hours or so. So it can get extremely unwieldy, and it takes about 10 to 12 hours just to run one scenario. All right. So similar to the natural gas world, I have created 2 worlds in Delhi. First world I call the reference world, which models the way things are in Delhi currently, where the renewable energy contribution to Delhi's electrical energy is less than 1% or so. The second world I create, I call the clean energy world, where I model that there is an aggressive penetration of wind energy resources into Delhi's electricity grid. About 30% of the energy is supplied by Tamil Nadu's wind generation plants, and about 10% of the energy comes from the solar energy plants in Rajasthan. So the renewable energy provides about 40% of total electrical energy requirement in Delhi. Now let's see how the grid dispatch looks, how the demand will be met with these resources. So this is simulated demand for Delhi in the summer of 2022. This is an average summer day in Delhi. So coal provides most of the base load energy. Natural gas provides the intermediate load energy and also provides some of the load following attributes to the system. So coal and natural gas meet a significant chunk of Delhi's demand in the reference case. And hydro and spot market purchases provide the load balancing and meet the rest of the demand. A quick note about the spot market purchases. So the spot market purchases are usually the most expensive purchases that utilities would make from the market. And that's why utilities would want to avoid as much as spot market purchases as they would. Now let's see how the demand would be met in the clean energy case. So the coal generation drops significantly. Natural gas generation drops significantly. And wind and solar energy projects take the center stage, with hydro and spot market meeting the rest of the demand. The interesting fact about spot market, look that in the clean energy case, utilities still have to purchase the power from the spot market, but the time at which utilities purchase power has shifted from the peak time to an off-peak time. And the spot market prices during the off-peak are significantly lower than the peak time. Now, let's look how the demand would be met in monsoon, where the wind energy generation peaks and Delhi demand also peaks. So this is an average monsoon day in Delhi in 2022. So gas and coal meet most of the demand, with hydro and spot market providing rest of the contribution. And spot market takes a central role in actually meeting the peak demand in monsoon. Now in the clean energy case, the coal and gas generation drops significantly, while wind and solar again take the center stage, with wind dominating the show, so to say, and hydro energy generation meets the rest of the demand, also provides load balancing. And as you can see, in monsoon, on average, clean energy can completely avoid the spot market purchases in Delhi. So all this is beautiful, but what is the incremental cost of doing it? So the simulated costs for the average cost of electricity generation in the reference case as it exists today is about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is same as the average cost of electricity generation in the US. But in the clean energy case, the incremental cost is only 15%. It goes to just 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And one of the main reasons why the cost is only 15% is utilities save significantly because of the avoided spot market purchases. And the incremental cost may actually be lower if it is compared with imported fuels being used in the reference case, which are significantly costlier. All right, so the key conclusions are there is a very strong seasonal and diurnal correlation between renewable energy in India and electricity demand in Delhi and to the northern region in general. Grid integration of large-scale renewables is feasible in India with only small incremental costs. And thirdly, and most importantly, however, regional coordination in power system planning for evacuating, say, Tamil Nadu's wind energy to Delhi's power system and so on. So the regional coordination is the key. All right, so let's move on to my third piece, which is analyzing the impact of energy efficiency programs on utility finances and consumer tariffs. I'm using the state of Delhi as the case study for the same reasons as stated before. And this piece has already been published in Energy Policy earlier this year. So I know we are running short on time, so I'm exactly going to take 2.5 minutes to cover this. All right, the specific research questions I'm looking at is what would be the impact of energy efficiency programs on utility finances? What would be the impact of energy efficiency programs on consumer tariffs or electricity rates? And I address these questions by developing a rate-making model for Delhi utilities. Yeah.
Just for the timing, you still have 6 more minutes before you get to 45 minutes.
Okay.
So it would seem to me that you should just take 6 minutes
Okay.
instead of 2. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Thank you. All right. Again, I mean, I don't think I have time to explain the whole model per se, so I'll just jump to key findings of this research. So what I find is most of the appliance energy efficiency potential in India and in Delhi particularly exists in the residential and commercial sectors. Now, Indian electricity sector is characterized by differential pricing of electricity, which means that the high-end commercials, high-end consumers pay a significantly higher electricity price than most of the poorer consumers and agricultural consumers, for example. So these residential and commercial consumers pay a significantly higher marginal tariff or the marginal price for electricity than the cost of their supply. For example, what that means is they pay significantly higher than what it costs the utility to supply electricity to them. So that's why if these consumers install efficient appliances, their electricity consumption reduces and results in a significant revenue loss for the utility. Now, this is a well-known barrier for energy efficiency programs anywhere in the world. And so there are several ways of addressing it. So one of the most prominent mechanisms used to address this barrier is decoupling. What that means is the utilities' sales and revenues are decoupled. So even if utilities' sales reduce, utilities' profit margins remain intact and they don't lose any money just because consumers became more efficient. So California utilities are decoupled. Even Indian utilities are decoupled for a different reason than energy efficiency, but the fact is they are decoupled. But the problem with the way decoupling works in India, it ensures full recovery of utilities costs, but only ex post, which means that utility has to go to the state electricity regulator and has to explain that there is a loss of revenue and we have to make sure that this revenue should be recovered. And the regulator holds several public hearings, and there is a delay of at least 2 to 3 years until utility actually recovers all this lost revenue. And until that happens, the utility's cash flow is consistently negative, which is at least 2 to 3 years. And this negative cash flow could be as high as 15 to 20%, and in some cases, 50% of utilities' profit margins. And that's why utility has a strong disincentive, despite decoupling, to implement any of the energy efficiency programs. And that's why addressing this utility cash flow barrier is the key to expanding energy efficiency programs in India. And the second important finding is consumer tariffs or the electricity rates increase as a result of energy efficiency programs, but the participant consumers, that is the consumers who actually install efficient appliances, they still benefit because though they are paying more on a per unit basis for electricity, their overall electricity consumption goes down because of the efficient appliances. That's right. So summing it up, so I worked on 3 topics that are critical to a low carbon development path for India: the natural gas, and where I find price liberalization can increase the total welfare significantly. And if India wants to increase natural gas supply, price liberalization is recommended. On renewable energy, grid integration of large-scale renewable energy projects is feasible only at a small incremental cost in India. And thirdly, on energy efficiency, addressing the utilities' negative cash flow barrier is the key to expanding energy efficiency programs in India. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
So do we have questions from the audience?
Well, thanks, Nikit. That was really, really good. I had a question about your first model on the natural gas markets. Two questions, one clarification and then a follow-up. How did you handle the international prices for LNG? How were those determined in your model?
Well, I've assumed just an historical kind of, I've projected it based on historical trends. But I have created scenarios where there is a price shock in the international market, then what happens, and so on. But for the model, I've just assumed one exogenous LNG price.
I'm curious what you think might happen if LNG contracts shifted away from oil price benchmarking, sort of developed a trajectory of their own. Do you think that complicates any of the liberalization scenarios you talked about?
Well, yes and no, because LNG are anyway a fringe supply in India. They're only about 25% of the total supply. But since they also become the competitive fringe, they essentially limit the rents that the domestic producers can extract. That may have an impact, but I'm not sure significant impact, because, yeah?
Yeah, I have a question about your second model.
Sure.
I noticed how you reduced, in your energy efficient world, you reduced your coal production, which is great, but I also noticed that there was a lot of variability on an average basis. And if that's realistic to have coal spinning up and down throughout the day, although I realize it's an aggregate value.
Right.
And if you've reduced coal, does that mean you've retired a lot of coal plants? And then if you haven't, wouldn't there be enough coal still available that would be cheaper than having a spot market at the end of the day?
Yeah, well,
Kind of curious about.
yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't retired any of the coal plants. So this is for the future. So the utility just doesn't build more coal plants. So the existing coal plants stay as they are. And in terms of variability in coal plants, so this is the kind of ramp up and ramp down rates that the coal plants can achieve. I've used based on the actual observed ramp up and ramp down rates that the Indian utilities already achieve. So the variability in coal plants is based on the actual numbers.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nikit. That was great. I have 3 questions, but they're very brief. The first one is about the consumer welfare increase.
Yeah.
I was wondering, overall it increases, but I was wondering if you had done any equity or distributional considerations, even though overall it increased. The second question was clarification. Is the integration of the renewable and the north and south energy markets, is that a regulatory problem or a physical problem? And the final question, which is related to that, is the price liberalization. You speak of price liberalization of the gas market, but I guess you wouldn't agree with a price liberalization in the renewable energy market. So perhaps you could speak to that.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot. Great questions. So on the distributional and equity impacts, you're absolutely right. So on average, it increases. But for some consumers, it actually reduces. And the reason is that those consumers are actually paying less in the regulated regime than in the price liberalization regime. But the point is, on average, it increases. So that's why there is a possibility for some transfer payments and still mitigating that reduction in surplus. Your second point about integration of the renewable sources from the south to the north, the problem is physical and regulatory both. So on one hand, there is not enough transmission infrastructure for transmitting this electricity from south to the north. In my model, I've considered building more transmission lines, but this could be one of the challenges, building the transmission lines in reality. The regulatory problem per se is that since all the Indian grid is connected, the actual electrons that were generated by the wind energy generators in the south do not have to flow all the way to the north. So it can just be a notional kind of transfer. So the southern state can just consume those electrons and instead just send electrons generated by some other coal power plant to the northern region. So this mechanism has to be facilitated, and that can be facilitated only through a regulatory kind of mechanism. And people have started doing that in India. So they have started trading the renewable energy certificates and so on and so forth. On your third issue of liberalizing the renewable energy prices, that has kind of started happening in India. So now, for most of the newer projects, regulators no longer control the prices at which renewable energy is bought. Instead, there is an open reverse auction or open bidding where the renewable energy producers bid whatever the prices they are. And in fact, in the recent biddings that happen in India for procuring solar power projects has actually shown pretty encouraging results. So solar power costs have come down by nearly 50% to the regulated levels.
Okay, all right, any more questions? Yep, back there, and then maybe we'll wrap up after that one.
Thanks again. I had two really quick questions on both pertaining to the second model. I was curious, the reference case basically showed no increase or no renewable energy generation, pretty much of any sort in the reference case. And I was curious, especially in the context of the RPSs that already exist, are they just very low level RPSs, or what explains that lack of any renewables in the reference case? And the second question is, in your policy case, it's a really aggressive renewable energy policy with a lot, like 40% renewable energy is the target. And so I was curious whether that is partly due to the fact that you need a lot of transmission, that you set a very high goal to make it more economically viable than shooting for a smaller renewable energy target where you would still need all of that similar transmission lines, or if you could talk about that.
Great questions. On the first question, states have implemented RPSs, but the problem in the north of India is that there's just not enough renewables potential in the north. So though utilities are mandated to buy renewables and they want to buy renewables, they just cannot, because there is just not enough renewable energy generation available. And so that's why they have started creating newer mechanisms of trading the renewable energy certificates and so on and so forth. But that is still not working out, especially in the north, because people are just not willing to trade because there are RPSs in all other states in India, which are pretty aggressive. So unless there is a specific mechanism for transmitting renewable energy from the south to the north, either way physically or by creating a separate mechanism, that is not going to happen. On your second part about the aggressive clean energy targets, yes, I agree. They're really aggressive. But in general, I've also developed several scenarios where it starts with a small target and then grows on to a more aggressive target. I only presented the results for the aggressive case, but it really has nothing to do with the transmission capacity and the economies of scale. It's just how far you can achieve. And the objective of showing that is even if it is 40%, you can still achieve it, and the incremental cost is only small. So for smaller percentages, it's definitely feasible.
Okay, all right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, before we break, I have to do this. So I really want to thank all my committee, John, Larry, Jim, and Jayant. John has been an amazingly encouraging and supportive advisor. I could not have asked for a more supportive or encouraging advisor. And earlier this year, John mentioned to me, Nikit, what are you doing next? So John, I took that as a clue and scheduled the defense. And, and Larry has been amazingly helpful as well. He's a perfectionist, so he wants everything precisely worked. But he is very helpful, very supportive. And every time I walked out of Larry's office, my head was full with newer ideas for improving the model. Jim has taken interest in my work right from my first year at Stanford. In fact, the very first class I attended at Stanford was Jim's class. It's Economics of Natural Resources. And Jim, I'm using the same notation you taught in that class in my natural gas model. And Jayant, who was driven all the way from Berkeley, I've been working with Jayant and with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for the last 3.5 years, and I've learned a lot from Jayant and his team in general. So thanks a lot. And David Victor, too, who unfortunately left to UCSD in my second year here. But he was the first one at Stanford who assured me that I can still be here and work on India. So thanks a lot, David, too. The most amazing community on campus, the E-IPER community. Helen, Jen, Daniel, Noah have been amazing support. And all the students at E-IPER, Rochelle, Marilyn, Rodrigo, and everyone else. Catherine and Pam of Peace. They have been very helpful, answering all my stupid and silliest emails with immense patience. And the whole team at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And finally, my lovely wife, Amruta, who has been there always for me, and it wouldn't have been without her. So thanks a lot, everyone.